The first speaker today will be Dan Zahavi. He's professor of philosophy and the director of the Center for Subjective Research at the University of Copenhagen. His research areas include phenomenological philosophy and philosophy of mind. Self as a topic is very close to Dan. He has written about self-consciousness, intersubjectivity, shame, and collective intentionality. For myself, his book Self and Other from 2014 was a particular eye-opener, especially in outlining the argument about self being implicated in all experiences and not only in social situations. Before we start, I should also apologize for this slight delay in our schedule. We are running 10 minutes late. It was because we had some problems with the internet connections, but they are all mended now. And I also want to say that I particularly appreciate Dan giving this talk today, because this is also the day, or one of the days, I think it is a long ceremony when he's receiving a honorary doctorate from University of Copenhagen. So congratulations for that. And it's great that in the midst of these ceremonies you are also participating this Self Symposium. So Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation. So I'll just jump straight into it, because I have a lot I would like to share with you. The idea that selfhood is socially distributed is, I think, an idea that has gained some headway in cognitive science in recent years. But it's actually an idea that has already been present in anthropology and cultural psychology for quite a long time. There's a classical article that Marcel Mauss wrote in 1938, where he criticized what he called the cult of the self. And the basic argument that Mauss made there was that even if many of us might find it very natural to attribute and assign a very crucial importance to the individual self, and even if one might assume that such a notion of an individual self is absolutely natural and fundamental, in fact, it must be considered a rather specific Western invention. One that in many ways are influenced by a number of specific religious, legal, and philosophical ideas. So this was an article from 1938, and Mauss's ideas have subsequently been picked up by a number of very influential anthropologists and cultural psychologists. Where the argument has been that if we look outside of a European context, what we will find are very often more relational, more collectivist, more groupist conceptions of self. One famous advocate of this is Clifford Geertz, who in a central article from 1974 wrote as follows: "The Western conception of the person as a bounded, unique, more or less integrated motivational and cognitive universe, a dynamic center of awareness, emotion, judgment, and action, organized into a distinctive whole and set contrastively both against other such wholes and against its social and natural background, is, however incorrigible it may seem to us, a rather peculiar idea within the context of the world's cultures." Other people picked up on this in a very influential article from 1982. We find a contrast being made between a Western egocentric conception of self, where the self is viewed as a discrete and self-reliant entity, where in a Western context, the autonomous individual is prioritized, and where society is merely viewed as something that serves the interest of these freestanding individuals. And this Western egocentric conception is then contrasted with a non-Western sociocentric conception, according to which the self is not distinguished from the social context, where selfhood is primarily understood as a question of occupying culturally determined social roles. And to mention just one final example of this way of thinking, in a very influential article from 1991, the cultural psychologists Markus and Kitayama were also arguing that people in different cultures have different construals of how to understand the relationship between self and other, and that this affects the nature of individual experience. And so they distinguish between what they call the independent Western conception, where the self is viewed as independent, self-contained, autonomous, and they contrast that with the interdependent, non-Western conception, where others and the social context are focal in individual experience, where the self depends upon the social context and changes according to the social situation, and where others on this conception are actually included within the boundaries of the self. Now, on all these readings, the alleged non-Western self is supposed to be less individuated and less differentiated than the Western self. But I think there are some obvious questions about how exactly to interpret claims like these. I mean, is the main concern specific cultural ideologies and normative frameworks, or does it really target, you know, the difference in basic psychological structures? One might also say or ask whether the focus is on conceptions of selfhood or rather on manifestations of selfhood. And unfortunately, it's not always super clear when reading these articles. So let's go back to the piece by Markus and Kitayama. I mean, what position is it that they actually defend? On the one hand, it seems as if what they want to say is that the so-called Western conception of a discrete and autonomous self is not as universal as many people have assumed, and that it, moreover, is actually not fitting or matching sociological and psychological reality. So here's what they say: even within highly individualist Western cultures, most people are still much less self-reliant, self-contained, or self-sufficient than the prevailing cultural ideology suggests that they should be. So this actually seems to suggest that there is a divide between the ideology on the one hand and the psychological reality on the other, and that the Western ideology of self is simply not, again, matching the way people actually experience their own selfhood. However, in the very same article, Markus and Kitayama also argues, and I think this is basically in contrast with the point just made, they also argue that internalized cultural norms can determine the very nature of individual experience and thereby ultimately the nature of selfhood. They argued that there are cultures favoring the interdependent construal where, as I already quoted earlier, others rather than the self serve as the referent for organizing one's experiences, and that there are indeed cultures where the individual is no longer the primary unit of consciousness. I think this is a much, much stronger claim than, you know, the earlier one. Might there be ways of kind of cashing this out? Well, consider the case of shame. I think that shame, and in particular what is known as vicarious shame, might be a good example of an emotion or an experience where others are included within the boundaries of the self. But of course, the problem is whether cases like vicarious shame can justify making much more grandiose claims, as for instance the following: that experience is always simultaneously social and subjective, collective and individual, as two anthropologists argued in 2007. I mean, to claim that all perceptual and all bodily experiences are interpersonally anchored strikes me as being fairly implausible. I also think that the very claim that individuals in non-Western cultures are no longer the primary units of consciousness is a very implausible claim, if that is supposed to entail that non-Western individuals cannot distinguish their own perceptual experiences from those of others, or that they say feel the pain of others in the same way as they feel their own. Now, what I think is often conflated here is basically the issue of individualism versus individuality. Individualism is a specific ideology that privileges and valorizes the non-social individual, whereas individuality is basically a question of recognizing community members as distinct subjects of experience. And one cannot conclude that sociocentric cultures that do not promote individualism, that is, cultures where individual interests are subordinated to the good of the collective, do not contain individual subjects. I think this is simply a fallacy. Interestingly, this was clearly recognized by Marcel Mauss, who, as I mentioned, is part of the kind of founder of this whole way of looking at or discussing the relationship between self and other, because as he made very clear in his 1938 article, his target was the concept of self as a cultural category and the question of how individualism came to acquire its contemporary significance. He was concerned in other ways or words with the historical and culturally divergent conceptions to us that there has never existed a human being who has not been aware not only of his body, but also at the same time of his individuality, both spiritual and physical. So I think that Mauss is very clear about the distinction between individualism and individuality, whereas I think many subsequent theorists have tended to kind of conflate these two notions. Now, another thing that I also would argue must give pause is really the very distinction between a Western and a non-Western conception. I mean, just thinking about it for a second should make it clear that this is an obvious simplification. I mean, not only does it overlook the diversity of non-Western cultures, but it certainly also presents us with an astonishingly crude account of how the self has been conceived in Western history and culture. I mean, just think of thinkers like Aristotle, Locke, Rousseau, Hegel, James, Heidegger, and Nietzsche. I mean, these are all Western thinkers, and obviously they did not all have and defend the very same notion of self. Now, interestingly, in the article, Markus and Kitayama, I mean, they actually admit that this notion of an independent self that they are promoting as the Western conception is prototypical of white middle-class men with a Western European ethnic background. And they concede that it's less apt when it comes to women as well as men from other ethnic groups and social classes. But given all these reservations, I mean, one might still wonder why they are labeling it as the Western conception. Now, to go a little bit further into the kind of theoretical background here, I think we need to ask exactly what the anthropologists and the cultural psychologists have in mind when they talk about the self. Because often it seems as if we only need one notion. I mean, the notion of self is univocal, and then we can talk about whether it's Western or non-Western. But I don't think that way of discussing the question really matches with the way philosophers have been discussing the notion of self in recent years. I mean, there's a lot of controversy about the nature, the structure, and the reality of self. And I think that there's one idea that is increasingly gaining momentum, and that is the idea that the self, rather than being simple and univocal, is actually quite multifaceted. Now, this is not a new idea. I mean, already in William James's Principles of Psychology, we find this distinction between material, social, and spiritual self. In Ulrich Neisser's work, we find a distinction between ecological, interpersonal, extended, private, and conceptual self. And in a famous Target article in Journal of Consciousness Studies, Galen Strawson basically summarized the kind of ongoing debate by distinguishing something like 27 different notions of self. So there's a lot of confusion, but as I said, there seems to be a certain convergence or a certain consensus about the need for distinguishing different aspects or dimensions of self. And this is not just a point made by philosophers, it's also a point made by people pointing to evidence coming from neuropsychology and neuropathology. So let me just kind of highlight two different dimensions that I think is kind of important to keep apart. So on the one hand, let's talk about a normative dimension of self, which I think incidentally can very well serve as an example of how one also in Western culture can find defenders of a sociocentric conception. Because what is this normative self? What does that amount to? Well, let's look at the communitarian criticism of liberalism. According to communitarians, the self is a kind of being that can only exist within a normative space. So it's precisely by living a life in accordance with normative guidelines that I develop my own view or perspective on matters and thereby develop a distinct individuality. Who I am, my self-identity, is really a question of what matters to me, what I care about. And that's why telling you that I am, say, pro-life and pro-gun rather than pro-choice would tell you something about who I am. So the basic idea here is that goals and preferences, what has significance for me, what has meaning for me, is all something that constitutes my being as a self. And the point being made then is that all of this is obviously shaped by the community of which I'm part. So rather than being an antecedently individuated self, rather than being someone who only contingently is embedded within a community, most communitarians would argue that my identity as an individual has a communal origin. And again, this is a distinctly Western position. Now, I think that it's clear that there are dimensions of self that are social and which are first established in and through socializations. And I guess it's kind of obvious to point to, for instance, norms and values. And I think that these dimensions can be lost, for instance, in severe dementia. But I also think there are other arguably more fundamental dimensions. I mean, consider the fact that we are perceiving and engaging with the world from an embodied perspective. I perceive objects as being to the right or left of me, or as being close by and further away. And according to some developmental psychologists, from early infancy, children can discriminate their own bodies from the surrounding environment, can perceive whether a given action is their own or not. This is not a product of a kind of long-lasting process of socialization. Likewise, consider the claim that our experiential life isn't simply characterized by its qualitative features, but also by its subjective character. There's not just something it is like, qualitatively speaking, to taste coffee, to feel a headache, or to enjoy a movie, because we don't feel hunger, pain, distress, fatigue, enjoyment simply as free-floating anonymous events, but rather as self-concerning experiences. So when feeling nausea, for instance, it's not the case that I'm faced with a two-step process where I first detect the presence of an unpleasant experience, and then in a second move needs to figure out whose experience it actually is. Rather, experiences are from the outset something for a subject. They involve a point of view. They come with what has been called perspectival ownership. And so according to this way of thinking, rather than simply talking about the what it's likeness of experience, it would actually be more pertinent to talk of the what it's like for me-ness of experience. So we need this subjective component as well. And that's why some people have argued that a minimal notion of self is a built-in feature of experiential life. And for that reason, as Joseph Margolis once put it, only the utter elimination of experience could possibly vindicate the elimination of selves. Now, I think that the communitarian conception of a normative self and this more experiential conception, I think both of them are targeting important dimensions of self. And fortunately, I don't think we need to choose between these two dimensions or conceptions. I think we can have both. But I also think that they have to be distinguished. I mean, because otherwise we are just going to make a lot of confusing claims. And unfortunately, I don't think that this distinction has been sufficiently heeded in recent anthropological and cultural psychological discussions. Rather, I think there's a tendency to lump both notions together and then to take findings that clearly pertain to the normative dimension and use that as evidence regarding the nature and structure of the self tout court. And let me just give you two examples of that. So back to Markus and Kitayama. One study that they discuss found that whereas 64% of European American mothers stressed building children's sense of themselves as an important goal of child rearing, this only held true for 8% of Chinese mothers. And incidentally, one might wonder whether that is still the case now, 25 years later. Probably not, but let's forget about that complication. The problem is what that kind of finding tells us about the collectivist nature of self. I don't think a lot, honestly. I think it has to do with this, again, individualism versus individuality distinction. Another example could be taken from the paper that I earlier quoted from by Clifford Geertz, where he, after having suggested that the preoccupation with self as a center of awareness is a peculiar Western invention, mentions the case of a young Javanese man whose beloved wife died quite suddenly, and who afterwards did his utmost to flatten the hills and valleys of his emotion in order to appear as calm as possible. Now, Geertz takes this case to demonstrate the parochiality of the Western conception of selfhood. But again, I just don't understand what that has to do with the role of the self as a center of awareness. I think it has something to do with, rules pertaining to the public manifestation and display of emotions. So I think that, again, things are conflated. And what I really think has to be kept apart is really different explanatory agendas, because I think it's one thing to show that what we experience can be influenced by social relations and power structures, and that, say, the significance we attribute to personal experience might be historically and culturally modulated, and that our social identity categories are discursively constructed. I think one can argue for all that. I think all of these claims are true, but I think they are very different claims than making a more radical claim, namely to argue that experience, that is phenomenal consciousness as such, or the subjectivity of experience as such, is also the product of specific cultural pressure, the specific discursive power structures. But again, I think there's a tendency to move from one type of claim to the other without really paying attention to the fact that these are very different claims. And let me just mention one further example to illustrate this, and this is taken not from the field of anthropology or cultural psychology, but rather from the case of history. So John Scott wrote a very influential paper in 1991 called The Evidence of Experience, where her agenda was historiographical. She was basically critical of the prevalent tendency in feminist studies to base its understanding and theorizing of women's reality on the reporting of personal experience. I think this criticism have merit. I mean, I think we should be skeptical of the claim that nothing can be truer than a subject's own account of what she has lived through. I mean, there might be all kinds of ideological factors manipulating this account. But what then happens in this article, The Evidence of Experience, is that after having made these claims, Scott suddenly starts engaging with topics from philosophy of mind. And she then argues that experiences are linguistic events, that the coherence and unity of selves are socially constructed, and that subjects and identities are constituted discursively. And again, I mean, these are claims that one can also find in more contemporary anthropological discussions, but I just fail to understand what exactly the line of argument and the kind of evidence in support of this might possibly be. So just to, and I'm really wrapping up now. I mean, if one follows this more radical claim, well then, and if the claim is that selves per se are socially distributed and socially constructed, well then that would also have to go for the experiential subjects. And in order to defend this claim, it's not sufficient to show that consciousness emerges in a social context. No, what really has to be shown is that first personal experience is constitutively dependent upon social interaction, not only in regard to its specific content, that is what I experience, but in regard to its very being. I mean, that there is experience. And so, of course, on this account, I mean, a crying newborn, not yet subjected to, a discursive regimentation, would not be experiencing distress, would not yet be a subject of experience. And I think that in itself is already a very counterintuitive claim. But I think the real challenge would actually be to then explain how this experienceless creature would become phenomenally conscious as the result of some kind of discursive regimentation. And again, I have no idea what that line of argument could possibly look like. Now, just one possible retort to this criticism. I mean, it could be argued perhaps that I'm kind of confusing matters, because what is at stake here, what is being disputed here, is not the question of having experiences. No, it's a question of classifying these experiences as inner, private, subjective, etc. And the claim could be that all of this is really something that only happens at a relatively late stage in development, and that it in many ways is the result of interpersonal communication. So the claim being made could be that a child only comes to acquire a sense of the perspective of others, and thereby comes to appreciate the particularity of its own perspective as a result of social interaction. But I think that making that kind of argument, and I have absolutely no problem with that argument, I agree with it, I think that's just shifting the focus of conversation, because the people who are defending a more experiential account of selfhood as I am, I mean, that kind of account is not an account that seeks to figure out how we classify and categorize our experiences. I mean, that's not the purpose of that account. No, the account is trying to get to the nature of phenomenal consciousness as such. The argument is that our experiences, in virtue of being the phenomenally conscious episodes they are also intrinsically and inherently first personal. And the argument would be that experience is first personal even prior to us acquiring the capacity to conceptually classify and categorize this first personal dimension. So again, if one really wants to, block this line of argument, one would have to show that absent relevant social interaction, there either would be no experiential life whatsoever, or the experiential life in question would not be first personal, but would be publicly available and intersubjectively accessible in the same way as public objects, I mean, including cobblestones and clouds. And I just don't understand, or I don't see what kind of argument that could possibly support this line of theorizing. So to conclude my talk, I would want to argue that the self is a multifaceted phenomenon. I think that a comprehensive account of self is one that would require us to both differentiate different levels, but also to integrate these different levels of analysis. And I think that to argue without further qualification that the self is discursively and culturally constituted and socially distributed, that it's nothing without the collective and basically reducible to some nexus of culturally determined roles, I would consider this kind of claim basically indefensible. I really think that a failure to properly distinguish cultural, conceptual, experiential perspectives on the different dimensions of self leads to a mischaracterization of the research domain, and therefore also to poor social science. And making this point, and I want to emphasize that in closing, is not to deny the crucial importance of sociality. I think we can acknowledge that. We can acknowledge that the attitudes of others, their respect and support are of absolutely crucial significance for one's quality of life, for our flourishing as individuals. But I don't think acknowledging all of that should also commit us to the view that the experiential sense of self, the very subjectivity of experience, the self understood as a locus of awareness, is equally socially distributed. Thank you very much for your attention.